In the Wild West, justice came with a fist, a rope, or a branding iron. These are the real punishments dished out across saloons, dusty streets, and forgotten forts. Some you've heard of, most you haven't. And trust me, they're worse than you think. Branding with hot irons. Thieves and rustlers were often seared with hot metal, leaving permanent marks, usually letters like T for thief or H for horse stealer. It was pain mixed with humiliation, and everyone who saw the scar knew what you were. Hanging by vigilante mobs, forget judges. Mobs formed committees, held quick votes, then strung men up from trees or posts. Innocent or guilty didn't matter. Once the rope was over the neck, it was already too late. The necktie party. Some towns turned hangings into social events. People showed up dressed nice, brought food, and watched someone die. The crowd cheered, laughed, and even posed for photos near the swinging body. Pure Wild West darkness. Hanging by the thumbs. Soldiers who disobeyed orders could be strung up by their thumbs, arms stretched above their heads. They were left dangling for hours, blood circulation cut, shoulders screaming in pain. It didn't break skin, but it tore through nerves. Humiliation in front of the whole garrison. Some passed out, others cried, and yet it was considered minor punishment. Try deserting after that. Most never even thought about it again. The bucking strap. Tied with arms and legs pulled back like a hog, the soldier was strapped down and left on the ground. Breathing was hard, limbs went numb, and your back arched unnaturally. They left you there in the sun, sometimes for hours. The pain wasn't just physical. It was meant to break your will. Officers didn't always watch, but the rest of the troops did. The wooden horse, Spanish donkey, a narrow wooden plank, sharpened at the top like a triangle. Soldiers sat on it, legs weighted down. Their crotch bore the weight, cutting off circulation and bruising everything below the belt. It didn't draw blood, but some never fully recovered their ability to walk. It looked simple, but it was pure torture in disguise. You might laugh at it, until you saw someone scream while sitting on it. Whipping with cat-o'-nine tails, military lashes weren't ordinary. The whip had multiple tails, sometimes with knots or metal tips. 25 lashes could flay your back open, leaving blood and muscle exposed. Each strike wasn't just punishment. It was a show, meant to scare everyone else. You could hear the screams across the entire fort. Some soldiers fainted, some didn't survive. Drumming out ceremony. When a soldier disgraced himself, he was stripped of rank and marched out in front of everyone. Drums pounded slowly as he walked, sometimes with signs around his neck or a shaved head. No weapons, no honor, just shame that echoed with every step. Other troops spat, jeered, or turned away in disgust. It was exile with an audience. Confinement in the guardhouse, dark, cramped, and often filled with rats and filth. The fort guardhouse was a hellhole. Offenders were crammed into tiny spaces with no beds and little food. Sometimes they'd be left alone for days in total darkness. You came out thinner, angrier, or broken. They didn't call it jail. They called it discipline. Chained to a post. Some soldiers were tied or chained to a post for days at a time. Rain, sun, or snow. They stood or sat in place, muscles cramping, minds slowly unraveling. There was no shelter, and food was thrown at their feet. It was solitary punishment in plain view. You watched the fort carry on, without you. Forced march in full gear. Marching miles with a full pack in scorching heat or freezing wind wasn't training. It was punishment. If you collapsed, they beat you and made you get up. Blisters bled through boots, sweat turned to salt on your face. You didn't get a break, only a lesson. Pain was the point. Mock executions. Some deserters were brought out blindfolded and made to believe they'd be shot. Guns aimed, orders shouted. At the last second, the shots were blanks, or the order was canceled. Their legs gave out. Some wet themselves. Then they were told to go back to work, shaken, but alive. It was mental warfare, and it worked. Horse dragging. tied behind a galloping horse and dragged across rocky terrain. This wasn't just deadly, it was messy. Skin peeled, bones snapped, and if the victim survived, they'd be disfigured for life. Pain was the point. Whipping posts, whipped in front of the crowd, backs torn open by leather straps soaked in water or salt. Sometimes it was 10 lashes, sometimes 50. Depends on the sheriff's mood. Some collapsed before it was over. Shooting as justice. Caught stealing? The sheriff might skip jail. A quick bullet to the leg or gut did the trick. Some towns treated the pistol as law, faster than paperwork, and louder than any courtroom. Tar and feathering. A boiling pot of tar poured onto your body, then feathers thrown on top. You'd be a walking, screaming chicken. Blistered skin, permanent scars, and shame that never went away. Crowds loved every second. Scalping, used and endured. Scalping was often seen during warfare, practiced by some tribes and later used by settlers and bounty hunters. The top layer of the scalp was ripped off, often while the victim was still alive. It wasn't just violence. It was a warning, pinned to a post or belt for everyone to see. The pain was indescribable, but the message was loud and clear. Cross us, and you'll wear death on your head. Some scalps were sold for cash, turning human suffering into currency on the frontier. Ritual, beating by the tribe. In some tribes, wrongdoers were brought before the community and beaten by elders or warriors using sticks or straps. It wasn't just pain, it was public shame. You stood in the center, and every strike reminded you who held the power. The crowd didn't look away. They watched, because justice wasn't private, it was shared. Banishment into the wilderness. Exile was one of the harshest sentences. The guilty were cast out with no weapons, no supplies, and no allies. The wind became your judge, the wilderness your jailer, and death was always just a mistake away. Lions, snakes, freezing nights. Nature was merciless, and even hunger could turn fatal. It wasn't always permanent, but most who left were never seen again. Torture fires, used in war. Captured enemies could be tied to stakes and burned slowly, not to kill, but to torment. The agony stretched for hours. Some warriors sang through the pain, refusing to scream, turning death into defiance. Hot coals were pressed against skin, or fire lit under toes to make it last. It wasn't just cruelty. It was ritualized war, meant to show power and honor through pain. Whipping with nettles. Stinging plants like nettles were used to lash wrongdoers until their skin swelled and burned. It left no permanent scars, but the itching, burning sensation drove many to tears, especially when done in front of the tribe. Children learned obedience by watching the pain, while adults were reminded of tribal order. Punishment didn't need blood to leave a memory, just enough pain to change behavior. Crushing, understones. Large stones were placed on the chest or back until bones snapped and breath stopped, used for traitors or taboo breakers. Each added rock felt like a final judgment, death by pressure, delivered slowly and without mercy. The body didn't scream, it collapsed. It was the kind of death that made others stay silent. In some cases, victims were told to confess as each stone was added, dragging it out longer. Finger removal. As punishment for betrayal or disgrace, a finger, often the trigger finger, was cut off. It made holding tools or weapons difficult and marked you forever as a man who crossed the line. One glance at your hand told others what you'd done. There was no hiding it. Repeat offenders sometimes lost more than one finger, until even feeding yourself became a challenge. Symbolic face markings. Some tribes punished by carving marks into a wrongdoer's face, or burning them with hot ash. These weren't just wounds, they were social death sentences. Everyone knew, and no one forgot. You couldn't remove them, you couldn't explain them. They were the explanation. Some people left the tribe in shame, unable to live with the looks they got daily. Execution by arrow. In justice rituals, archers would surround a condemned enemy and fire one by one. It was rarely quick. Each arrow was a message, not just death, but balance restored in the eyes of the tribe. The The slow process made the guilty feel every second of judgment, often begging before the final shot. Sometimes family members were required to fire the last arrow, a final act of loyalty to the tribe. Shaving heads and eyebrows. For petty crimes or dishonoring the town, some were publicly shaved bald, eyebrows included. It might sound harmless, but in the Wild West, appearance meant everything. This turned tough cowboys into laughingstocks for months. Some even left town in shame, too embarrassed to show their faces again. Forced nudity and parade, men and women were stripped naked and marched through town for public ridicule. No violence, just pure humiliation. Crowds laughed, threw rotten food, and took photos. It was psychological warfare, meant to break pride more than bones. Bricked into walls. Some outlaws were trapped in makeshift cells built inside walls, just big enough to crouch. No light, no room, no toilet. Sometimes they'd be forgotten for days. A slow-motion death sentence, and no one was counting time. Bullet-biting punishment. During lashings, victims were told to bite a bullet, not as mercy, but to muffle screams. If they broke a tooth or swallowed it, too bad. That's where the phrase "bite the bullet" was born, literally. Shot in the hand, caught cheating or stealing. Some sheriffs aimed for your hand instead of your heart. The wound shattered bones, ruined nerves. It was a warning shot with permanent consequences. You'd never draw a gun the same way again. Tied to cactus or ant nests, criminals were stripped and tied to cacti, or left on anthills with honey poured on them. The desert handled the rest. Painful, slow, and full of bugs, the wild handled vengeance like no jail could. Broken bottle beatings. Sometimes punishment came at the end of a bottle, smashed across a face, then used as a blade. Saloon justice didn't need a court. The glass cut deep, but what really hurt was being left to bleed in public. Nail through the ear. Repeat offenders were nailed by the ear to wooden posts, left for hours. Try to run? Tear your own ear off. Some stayed still and silent, hoping someone would care enough to pull the nail out. The ride on a rail. Men were forced to sit on a sharp wooden rail hoisted by others, bouncing along the road. Groins split, legs bruised, and by the end, many couldn't walk. Humiliating and excruciating all at once. Dark box confinement. Prisoners were shoved into tiny iron or wooden boxes left under the blazing sun. No room to move, no air to breathe, and the heat cooked them slowly. Some lost their minds before they were released. Water starvation. Guards would withhold water for days, even while temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Some inmates were surrounded by water buckets they couldn't touch, just to mess with their heads. Survival wasn't promised, and mercy was rare. Solitary and outhouse pits. Jailers threw inmates into cesspits, literally the bottom of the latrine. They were locked in knee-deep waste, alone, with rats and disease. No light, no dignity. Just the stench of punishment and slow despair. Chain gangs. Prisoners were shackled together by the ankles, forced to work roads, fields, or mines. One fell. They all fell. Sleep, eat, and sweat together. Escape was nearly impossible, and infection from the chains was common. Mock executions. Guards staged fake hangings or firing squads to scare confessions out of inmates. Blindfolded, tied up, heart pounding, and then nothing. It was terror as a tactic. You never knew if it was real or not. The ball and chain. Thick iron balls chained to prisoners' ankles made walking agonizing and escape pointless. You could barely move, let alone run. Many were forced to wear it 24/7, even while sleeping or eating in filthy cells. Public stocks in the sun, locked in wooden stocks on a dusty street corner. Prisoners sat helpless as people spat, mocked, and threw garbage. Bugs crawled, sunburned, and if you fainted, too bad. You stayed until the time was up. Vigilante hanging. No trial, no lawyer. Just a rope, a tree, and an angry crowd. Suspects were dragged from jails or caught in the streets, then strung up in minutes. Sometimes they weren't even guilty, just unlucky. A single shout of "string him up" was all it took. The West didn't wait for proof, just a reason. Tarring and feathering. Offenders were stripped, covered in hot tar, and rolled in feathers, then paraded through town. It wasn't meant to kill, but it burned like fire and left deep scars. Crowds jeered and threw garbage as they passed. It was humiliation turned into theater. The pain faded, but the shame stuck forever. Branding with hot irons. Sometimes vigilantes marked criminals with a hot iron, on the cheek, hand, or forehead. The letter stood for your crime. T for thief, M for murderer. It was fast, permanent, and brutal. You didn't need to explain your past. Your face did it for you. No hat could cover that kind of shame. Dragged by horse or wagon, ropes were tied to a man's feet or arms, and he was dragged across dirt, rocks, even cactus. Bones broke, skin shredded, and survival was slim. It was street justice, fast and merciless. Once the dragging started, there was no stopping the crowd. The dust settled, but the blood stayed behind. Mock trials. Some towns held trials just for show. A judge, jury, and executioner all from the same mob. The outcome was always guilty. The punishment always fast. You got 5 minutes to speak, and then the rope came out. It wasn't about justice. It was about revenge, and everyone knew it. Gunpoint exile. Instead of killing, mobs would sometimes run men out of town at gunpoint. They gave them 5 minutes to leave, or else. The man would flee on foot without his horse or belongings. If he ever came back, he didn't live long. One warning. That's all you got. Buried up to the neck. For certain offenses, mobs buried a person up to their chin in the dirt, left to bake in the sun. Insects, animals, and the elements did the rest. Sometimes they lived. Usually they didn't. It was slow, terrifying, and silent. Crowds watched like it was a show. Shot for sport. Some mobs didn't hang or beat. They lined men up and used them for target practice. Legs first, then shoulders, making it last. The final bullet was mercy, if it ever came. This was pure cruelty, fueled by rage, and no one stopped them. Thrown in wells or caves, if a mob didn't want a body found, they tossed victims down dry wells or into caves. Alive or dead, they disappeared for good. No grave, no name, just silence. Sometimes their bones were found years later by kids or minors, a reminder of justice gone dark. Scalding water ambush. Cheating husbands or violent drunks sometimes got scalded by their wives. A pot of boiling water dumped mid-sleep. It wasn't official punishment, but in some frontier towns, no one reported it. Blisters covered the skin, and infections followed. A message was left loud and clear. Harm me, and I harm you back. The sheriff rarely asked questions. He probably knew why. Poison pie revenge. Women with no legal power sometimes turned to arsenic or crushed glass baked into food. An abusive husband's last meal might have been a sweet slice of homemade pie. He'd die slowly, stomach tearing from the inside. Neighbors whispered, but no one testified. Justice didn't always wear a badge. Nail boards in boots. A known thief or abuser might find their boots stuffed with nails overnight. The next step they took tore through the soles, piercing into their feet. It didn't kill, but it sent a warning, loud and painful. Everyone in town heard the scream. No one ever claimed credit. Cattle branding by locals. Some townsfolk caught horse thieves and didn't wait for a hanging. They used branding irons meant for livestock. Thieves were burned with a big H for horse or C for cattle. It left a scar and worse, a reputation. The skillet beating, forget guns. Some frontier women settled scores with cast iron. A single hit to the head could knock a man cold or break his jaw. They weren't always charged, especially if the man was known for violence. Sometimes the sheriff called it self-defense. Sometimes he just laughed and walked away. Hogtie and humiliation, drunks or problem makers were sometimes hogtied and left in the town square overnight. They'd wake up covered in dirt, bruised, and surrounded by laughing kids. It wasn't deadly, but no one forgot it. The public shame hurt worse than any jail cell. Stuffed in a barrel and rolled, outlaws or troublemakers could be stuffed into a barrel and rolled down a hill, or even into a river. Bones broke, skin tore, and sometimes they drowned. If they lived, they usually left town fast. Widow's justice. When a woman lost her husband to a murderer and the law failed, she sometimes took things into her own hands. Many stories tell of widows who hunted down the killer themselves. One bullet, one moment, then they'd disappear. Salt rub into wounds. Captured rustlers were sometimes whipped, then had salt or pepper rubbed into the open cuts. It wasn't just pain, it was agony that lasted for days. Sometimes vinegar was poured in too, for good measure. This was the kind of punishment given by angry ranchers, not lawmen, and it made sure the lesson burned in. Shaving and parading. Men caught cheating or humiliating their wives were sometimes stripped, shaved bald, and paraded through town in women's clothes. It wasn't physical pain. It was mental, emotional, and public. They were laughed at, humiliated, and never lived it down. If you've made it this far, do us a favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to History Dictionary for more insane stories from the darkest corners of history.